Hello, and welcome to Yesterday, Today, and Forever, a virtual ministry of the Churches of Christ. It is our desire to present to the 21st century person the faith of the first century Christians. We seek unity through the acceptance of the faith that was once and for all time delivered unto the saints, a system of faith which first began to be spoken by our Lord prior to his crucifixion, and was later confirmed to the saints by the apostles and inspired writers of the New Testament. Thus a faith from yesterday to today and into forever. Our speaker is Brian Barrett, who preaches for the church at Bear Branch, in Spurlockville, West Virginia. We encourage all persons interested in the faith of our fathers to open their Bibles, as we search the Scriptures, for these eternal truths, which can lead Christians back into unity as the family of God. Now, here is Brian.
We're studying this morning in the book of John, chapter 19, verse 13. John, chapter 19, verse 13. Last week we were looking at some of Pilate's attempts to defuse the situation and hopefully be able to release Jesus. And as we were finishing up, in verse 12, it tells us, and from thenceforth Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, If thou let this man go, thou art not Caesar's friend. Whosoever maketh himself a king speaketh against Caesar. And then in verse 13 it says, When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus forth and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. And it was the preparation for the Passover, and about the 6th hour, and he said unto the Jews, Behold your king. They cried, Away with him! Away with him, crucify him. Pilate said unto them, Shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, We have no king but Caesar. Then delivered he him, therefore, delivered unto them to be crucified, and they took Jesus and led him away. And he, bearing his cross, went forth unto a place called the place of the skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha, where they crucified him and two others with him on the other side, one, and Jesus in the midst. We'll stop there. We may go a little bit further, but excuse me. As we look at these particular verses, we see the contradictions between, yes?
Before we leave from off the trial, there was one more deed he done that's not written, that John didn't write down.
Okay.
He tried to pardon himself by washing his hands.
Yeah.
We still hear that used today.
And he washed his hands of the whole matter.
Yeah.
He gave it over to the Jews. Of course, in other places we find that, they said, Let his blood be upon us. Of course, Pilate was more than happy to give them that opportunity. They act as if there are some great friend of Caesar here in these particular verses. And as we're looking at that, they're trying to, it's interesting, they're trying to appear to be the friends of Caesar and try to make Pilate look like, he's not really doing his job as was given to him by the Romans. And then they try to make themselves out to appear as if, they're so devout and so devoted to Caesar. They had no king but Caesar. And at the same time, they're plotting and planning just as much in the background, some of them to overthrow Caesar as they sought to kill Jesus. And that plot will continue to thicken Even among Jesus' disciples, we find, one who is called Simon Zelotes, and he was a zealot. And of course, the zealot rejected the authority of Rome over them and wanted to overthrow the Roman government. And these people were among those. And as we've seen in previous verses, even in our study of John, these Jewish leaders were concerned that the Romans would come and take away their place in their nation. And so they were plotting and planning how to gain more power and more control over themselves. And of course, when they start making statements here about releasing him, and they said, if we've brought this man, in essence, paraphrasing, we brought this man to you. He claims to be a king. He's trying to overthrow the rule of government. We've brought him to you, and you just keep making excuses why you're not willing to punish him, or you're not willing to do anything. Maybe you're not Pilate's friend. Maybe you're not a friend not Pilate, but Pilate is not a friend of Caesar. And of course, those are words that can get you in all kinds of trouble. That place, and I'm sure probably many others of the land of the Romans that they had control of, they watched very closely for rebellion. And when you look at the history of the Holy Land, as many people call it, going back after Herod the Great, there was a great deal of turnover, especially in people that were in Pilate's position, because it was very difficult to run a balance between keeping the Jews under control, getting Caesar what he wanted, and not ending up in some kind of uproar or problems. And we recently read from Luke 13, where they talked about the Galileans who Pilate killed in the temple and mingled their blood with the blood of their sacrifices. And so, it was a difficult time. And, when Pilate therefore heard that saying, that they didn't believe he was, a friend of Caesar's, that he was speaking against Caesar, he brought Jesus forth and sat down in the judgment seat in a place called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. And we're told that the time of this was about the 6th hour. And by that 6th hour, we're talking about the 6th hour from a reckoning of midnight to 6 a.m. And so we're looking at Roman time in these particular verses. And so it was about the 6th hour, which, if you think about that, a lot of things has been going on up to the 6th hour that we read about, from the time of the Garden of Gethsemane till we get down to this place. And so, because these Jewish leaders could not be reasoned with, as we would think, he called for Jesus to be brought forth, and he sat down in the judgment place, which John calls the Pavement. And the reason for that is, and we're told that it was made out of large blocks of stone. And of course, when you look there in Jerusalem, you'll see that the foundations and all of those buildings were considerable. And so there was a place that was made out of blocks of stones. The Hebrew, Gabbatha, means elevated or a platform. And so this area where there was a porch, a place where he could judge, was in what would appear to be an elevated position, where they could have some distance between those who were watching the proceedings versus those who were directly participating in it. And so it was in an elevated state. How far that would be, I don't know, but the Hebrew does define the fact that it was both elevated as well as the idea there of pavement, that it was made out of blocks or stone. And of course, here, this is one of the confusing things, because most of the other writers, people have implied that the Passover meal was when Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper. That was during the actual Passover meal. And of course, John makes that a little bit confusing, if that be the case, because we're told here that it was the preparation of the Passover. That was the preparation day, and that was when they were putting together all the various bitter herbs and the things that would be used in the Passover meal. And 3 o'clock that evening, the Passover lamb would be sacrificed. And so John clearly tells us that the Passover had not taken place. And so the meal that we call the Last Supper is in essence just that. It was Jesus' Last Supper with his disciples. Now, that was still part of the Passover in the sense that they were preparing themselves for the Passover, but we clearly see in the Passover meal there's no sign of a lamb there. Jesus speaks about dipping the bread in the sop, and the two things that he speaks of there during that is the bread and the cup, which was there, the unleavened bread and the cup, fruit of the vine. And so the meal that Jesus was having with his disciples, though it involves the Passover celebration, and would have been at the time that unleavened bread was being prepared and used, the leavening was being taken out, it was not the actual Passover meal. It was part of the Passover. I mean, that's why he's here to start with. It's why people are coming there. It is the Passover. And a lot of people say, that's just too confusing. No, I mean, you all understand this with Christmas, right? You know, where do you celebrate Christmas? Well, do you just do it on December the 25th? No. You prepare for it ahead of time. You go visiting with your friends and family and all in the days leading up to that. But Christmas isn't Christmas until December the 25th. And that's the day of Christmas itself. Now, people may have dinners and various things going on, but Christmas Day is still Christmas Day. And even after Christmas, most people leave their tree up and their lights on, and so the season still continues. A lot of people leave their lights and decorations up until after New Year's. And of course, if you follow the Greek Orthodox way of keeping track of time, the Epiphany and all of that, it goes all the way over into January away. So that's, yes.
That's where the song 12 Days of Christmas comes in.
Yeah.
It leads you all the way up into January.
Yeah, there's a lot of different, depending on which flavor of Christianity you've been exposed to, that's going to change. But again, here, in these passages, we talk about the Passover, and Jesus talks about, eating this Passover with them or having this meal with them. And again, the language of that is confusing to some because they believe that he's actually engaging in the Passover meal. But, again, if you get on a plane, 3 days before Christmas to fly home to mother and dad or family, you're going home for Christmas. Well, you're not going home for Christmas that day. Christmas isn't that day, but you are going home. And so we're going home for Christmas. And so we know that, again, there's all that around it. And so we just need to understand that the Passover was not just, while it was a meal, there were things leading up to it. You couldn't just get rid of the leavening the day of the Passover. You had to get rid of that and clean it all out of your house before that. And so you had to have unleavened bread and the things that would have been kosher for the Passover season. And so this is where we're at. And this is why there's such a hurry up kind of thing here, because they're coming up. It is the day of preparation. They're coming up to the observance of the Passover, and so we'll see that hurry up kind of attitude in all of this later on. And so it was about 6 o'clock in the morning, and Pilate brings him out there into the judgment area, the proclamation platform, whatever you want to call, and he again has them behold. And they cried again out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said unto them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. And so as you think about that, this kind of shows you as we said, the contradictions, the heart of the Jewish people. Even the leadership was willing to say just about anything to get what they wanted and to manipulate Pilate. And so we can see why Jesus in Matthew chapter 23 has so much to say about the scribes, the Pharisees, the hypocrites. Talks about the judgment that will come upon this generation. All the hopes that he and no doubt God the Father and the Holy Spirit had very little impact upon them. And so Pilate, it's interesting that he keeps this king thing going. It's a theme that he holds to, because he makes himself to be king of the Jews. And so Pilate says, you want me to crucify your king, and they have no king but Caesar. And then delivered he him, therefore, unto them to be crucified. And they took Jesus and led him away. Now, them that is in reference to here is not the Jews, but it is to the guard which were responsible for the crucifixion. And usually there were 4 Roman soldiers that were responsible for that. That they served in that capacity, so that I suppose they had enough that if they had to forcibly hold people down in order to be crucified and to guard them and to watch over them and all that, they had enough. And I guess a 4-to-1 kind of situation, even though there were others that were being crucified with him. And so they took him and they led him away. And 17 says, and he, bearing his cross, went forth unto a place called the place of a skull, which is called in the Hebrew Golgotha, where they crucified him and 2 other with him, on either side one, and Jesus in the midst. This place that's called the place of the skull is said to have been outside the city of Jerusalem, on a hill outside that area, and the stone formation had the appearance of a skull. Of course, I don't think it was actually chiseled out to look as if it was a skull, but the natural formation of the stone looked like a skull. And so I guess for the Romans, that made it a perfect place to crucify people. Because today, when we want to prove a point that something's dangerous, we put the skull and crossbones on things as a warning, that this is a place of death and you need to be very careful. And so it was interesting that we have this place that appears to look like a skull, and the Romans crucify people there. And so even if they don't have anybody to crucify, when people go by back and forth as they're coming and going, and the Romans used to like that too, to put the crucifixions along the road so that as people came into the town, they could see those people on the cross being crucified. And that was in and of itself a warning. Look what's going to happen to you if you don't mind your P's and Q's while you're here in the town. And some writers have mentioned the fact that some stayed on the cross for days. And people would come into the city to conduct business or do whatever they were, and the same people would be on the cross when they left the city. And so that was a troubling sight for some, and it gave them a warning. Now, the Hebrew, Golgotha, means the same thing, the skull. And it's interesting that here, when it talks about the place of a skull, the word in the Greek for skull here is cranion, which we get the word cranium. And so it's the same word. And so it actually was in the Greek called cranion, place of the skull. And so anybody around Jerusalem, when they were trying to point out something about that, well, it's the place of the skull. Go up that way toward the place of the skull. And so it was a perfect place for crucifixion. It was a perfect designation for directions, whatever you want to look at. And so Calvary, the word Calvary equals skull also. And so that's the reason that word is there too. So we have Calvary, we have the place of the skull, we have Golgotha, and so all those places are talking about the same thing, the skull. And of course they crucified him with two others, one on one side, one on the other, and it has been supposed that Barabbas was intended to be the one who would have been crucified in the middle, because he was under sentence by the Romans and he was released. And so Jesus takes his place on the cross as one of the three that was being crucified there that day. And so Barabbas is let go while Jesus is crucified. Any questions or comments?
Where it says he would bear his own cross, that don't mean he carried it, does it?
He left. The picture that we normally see is not necessarily always accurate. We see the actual, cross. We see him dragging that through the middle of the street. Many times the actual upright stake was there where the crucifixion took place, and the part that they generally carried was the cross piece, the actual crossbar that their hands were either tied to or whatever. And so, that it's not the whole cross as we think of it, but he probably was just carrying the part that would be placed, that his hands would be nailed to, and then that would be attached to the stake. And a matter of fact, some more modern translations, rather than using the term cross, they use the term crucifixion stake. and the stake, of course, being the pole that was there, and then the cross piece that was put on that. And of course, the two together combined makes up what we think of as the cross. But he did, again, he started out with that. Now we find in other places that they compelled someone else to carry it. And of course, the reason for that was that the severe beating, scourging that he had received was no doubt something that weakened him. Blood loss, the beating, the bashing, the bruising. Of course, he's been up all night, being moved around from place to place. And again, it's interesting that I've heard and read in some places that, again, carpenters were hired to supply those various points and pieces of the cross. And if you look at the actual cross part where they were hung on or tied to, there's not a great deal of difference between that and the yoke that the oxen were put in as far as making the beam and all of that. So some have commented on the fact that, carpenters, some probably made a living just providing the things of the cross, not that Jesus necessarily did, but it's just kind of another one of those interesting bits and pieces. Some carpenter probably prepared that cross that he carried, and somebody made a profit off of selling that cross to the Romans. Some have commented on the fact that just like Jesus, some were nailed to the cross and they couldn't, the wood, of course, because of the knots and things, it was hard to remove some of the nails. And so instead of they couldn't remove the nails, and so they just threw the cross and the person and everything else in a hole. And there is in some, I think it's a museum in England that has a foot bone that has a nail that was driven through it, and you can see where it hit a knot in the wood and it caused the nail to bend. And so it appears they just threw them in the grave with the cross and all still attached to them, at least the part that they were attached to, their feet. And so there's a lot of aspects to the crucifixion. It was a journey. If you where Pilate's palace was in the same vicinity of the Temple Mount. And so you have to get out of the palace and out of there and go out of the city and go up a hill where the Mount of Skull was. And so Jesus had to make that journey through the street and, in a very weakened condition. It's understandable why, there's a song, he fell beneath the load or the weight of the cross, and perhaps that is the case. It doesn't exactly say that he fell, but they compelled someone else to take it because it is apparent that he was not in any condition to have the strength to make that journey, dragging a wooden beam along with him. Just another way that, again, the convicts and those who were being crucified were made to suffer. It weakened them. Not everybody was necessarily scourged before they were crucified. That was something Pilate did in hopes of not having to crucify Jesus. And so many who would have to drag that wooden beam again were weakened, so that by the time they got to the place of crucifixion, they had kind of lost some of the fight. Even if they were willing or thought about fighting, they were dragging that, and so they were in a weakened condition, so it wasn't too hard for 4 people to deal with them.
He was dead already on the cross before he pierced his side.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll see that as we go on here. And then again, some people said, he sure seemed to die pretty quick. Well, again, when you think about all the things that he suffered, and if you know anything about blood loss, when you start losing blood, and if you pass out and your lungs are already in a strain, the muscles in all your lungs, some have said, it wasn't really from the blood loss that most people died on the cross. It was because the muscles in their chest became so weakened that, again, they couldn't breathe. Their lungs stopped. It began to fill up with water, and you basically suffocated or drowned in your own fluids. And so it wasn't pretty. No matter whether we're talking about Jesus' crucifixion or somebody else's crucifying people, was not, it most certainly was done with the intent of, getting you to think. Did crucifying prevent people from committing crimes? Well, apparently it didn't completely stop it, because there were 3 people, Barabbas and these other 2, apparently were going to be crucified that day. But you had to understand, if you got caught, that was going to be the case. And so, you had to really think about it. And so some people may very well have been turned away with the fact that, watching somebody die on a cross was a long, drawn-out thing. We supposedly try to be merciful in hanging people. We try to break their neck and they're supposedly unconscious, or we electrocute them, or we use poison gas. We've done a little bit of everything, firing squads with the intent that they not suffer very long. But the Romans, on the other hand, it was like a cat playing with a mouse. It didn't bother the Romans to watch you suffer. Yes?
If the rope broke back when they was hanging, and the rope broke, they couldn't hang you again.
You've already been hung once, so. But
Now that'll happen if the rope broke.
yeah. But again, when the Romans put you on the cross, you weren't coming down until, you were dead. And so, that's another thing. There isn't any way which the cross isn't going to work. Of course, a lot of people were tied to the cross. It really isn't about the nails. That's just kind of adds insult to injury. It's one of those things, if you were deemed to be a vile criminal or they were trying to make a point, they would nail you to the cross. But many people were just tied to the cross because, like I said, it's not about the bleeding. It's about the suffering, the muscles, suffocation. And so there they took them, and he was crucified. And sort of as a parting gesture of Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross. And the writing was, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. As part of the crucifixion, whatever you were being sentenced for was put on display also over your head on the cross. If you were a murderer, if you were a thief and robber, if you had done some other thing, a rebel and whatever, those sentences were placed on there. So when people drove by, so to speak, passed by, they could look and see what these individuals had been sentenced to death for. And so the writing on the cross was the charge, in essence, that was made against you. And so we're told that, there were crucified 2 others, which apparently were thieves or had been involved in other aspects of the same plot, perhaps. And it says, this title then read many of the Jews, for the place where Jesus was crucified was nigh to the city, and it was written in Hebrew and Greek and Latin. Of course, Hebrew, since this is a Jewish city in the center of Judaism, Hebrew would be one of the languages that would be spoken. Greek, which was a universal language that had been a part of the world since the Greek occupation prior to the Romans, was the language. And of course, the language of the Romans was Latin. And so these three languages were there so that just about anybody passing by would have been able to read at least one of these three languages. And so not only was it posted, but it was posted and translated into the different languages. Now, if you were being crucified somewhere else, it might have been in Egyptian and Greek and Latin or whatever, but here in what we think of as the Holy Land, it was Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. And we can see the fact that they weren't going to give up. They wanted to see this all the way through. And as we have said, some people misunderstand when it talks about many of the Jews. I mean, they were all Jews other than Romans or whatever, but these are the ones that we're talking about who conspired together to put Jesus to death. And so they wanted to see that through, and they followed him all the way to the place of the crucifixion. And by, of course, the time, this started about 6 o'clock in the morning, and by 9 o'clock, he's on the cross. And so by the time people begin to hear what's going on, he's already on the cross and being crucified. And so there were the Jewish leaders that were conspirators, if you want to call it that, conspirators together in that and conspired to that. And so when they came, the Jews apparently went back to Pilate because Pilate wasn't there, but they went to Pilate and said, "Write not the King of the Jews," but that he said, "I am the King of the Jews." That's not right. That wasn't our charge. Our charge was he said he was the King of the Jews. He made himself out to be king, but he's really not our king. That's the whole point. So, they were asking Pilate to take down that sentence and replace it with the one that they wanted. And so Pilate's answer to them is, "What I have written, I've written." In other words, it's not going to change. And so this is kind of one of Pilate's last thumbing his nose at the Jews for causing him all this commotion and turmoil. It wasn't like he didn't have other things going on. The Passover and trying to stay on top of everything and all the Jews that were there. And they're forcing his hand in the midst of all of this. And so, they said he made himself out to be a king. He asked him if he was. He said he was. To that point, he was born. He told Pilate that, his kingdom was not of this world. And so between him and Pilate, I think it may very well be another way in which, Greg was talking about Pilate washed his hands trying to say he was freeing himself off of that. And, Pilate seems to put that up there on the cross. It's like, I didn't say that he said he was a king. I'm just saying he was a king. So it's almost as if, if he is the Son of God, and if he is the King of the Jews, and if he's half man, here again, my hope is that whichever God he's the son of will see that I acknowledge that he was, the king. And so it's kind of the last thing Pilate said, what I've written, I've written. And so there they went ahead. He was crucified. People were there watching. And again, our time's about up for today.
Why not make this the day that you and your family seek out the Church of Christ in your community? We encourage you to attend one of our worship times or Bible studies. God's grace, truth, and salvation is truly worth finding and knowing. May God bless and keep you as we walk together in His truth. And remember, as always, the Churches of Christ salute you. Our new programs are posted to Facebook and YouTube on Thursday afternoon, and they should be available for viewing by 7 p.m. We also encourage our viewers to visit our website at www.thechurchesofchrist.life. We ask that you like us on Facebook and share our programs. On YouTube, please share and subscribe for notifications. This program was pre-recorded.